would be accurate to say that Reverend Emmalou Kirchmeier has become one of our favorites. She's certainly one of mine, and I'm happy to call her a friend. And so she's here to talk about, well, if experience is such a good teacher, why do I keep repeating the course? And that's that wonderful, we have Karen in our office to thank for all these pictures that she always finds as appropriate. Reverend Emmalou Kirchmeier.
Oh, thank you, Lorraine. It's always a joy to be back with you. I love being here. I have to say that that's a wonderful title, but it isn't mine. It's the title of the book that Ellsworth Kalas wrote, and we use it for women's work, and whenever I'm doing something special, Kalas usually has something special for me to find, and so I used his whole, because Sally thought it was a good title, I used it too. It wasn't until recently that I became far more interested in the Old Testament stories. As a preacher, we usually are always into what Jesus did in the New Testament. However, events in my life brought me into Old Testament stories. The first was because my grandson, Samuel, married a Jewish woman, and they named their first son Caleb. I had never heard of Caleb, so I started reading about him. And then the second grandson, Joshua, married a Christian woman, and they named their son Ezra, very Jewish name. So I started reading about him too. The reading led to war stories. One was a total win at Jericho, but a second was a complete failure. And that got me interested in defeat, which led to my topic today. As a journalist and a political science major in my undergraduate studies, I remembered that before being elected, President Abraham Lincoln never won an election. He just had a terrible background. But his very first loss was so personal. He was dearly expecting that Anne Rutledge would be his wife, and she married somebody else. That was his first big disappointment. When he first tried for a congressional seat, his opponent was a very fiery evangelist named Reverend Peter Cartwright, who had spread some vicious rumors about Lincoln's lack of faith. Lincoln decided he ought to hear him preach. Well, halfway through the sermon, Cartwright noted Lincoln's presence and asked the entire congregation, "All who decide to go to heaven, stand." Well, the whole congregation got up except for Lincoln. So then Cartwright asked, "All who do not wish to go to hell, stand." Lincoln still remained seated. With a twinkle in his eye, Cartwright boomed, "And where do you expect to go, Mr. Lincoln?" "To Congress, Mr. Cartwright, to Congress." Lincoln replied, and that was his sense of humor that hardly ever failed. He was always a man who could top anybody who was trying to criticize him. Ellsworth Kalas, whose religious works I read, once asked a well-known baseball player if it was true that he was a sore loser. The ball player hesitated and then said, "Well, I guess you could say that. Losing does not sit well with me." And I thought to myself, well, that's probably true. Why would anybody be happy about losing? Kalas, however, believes we all have trouble with losing, but he insists it's because of something in our background. We never forget our first loss. And I read that line and I thought, oh, is that true? We never forget. I was about third grade, I think, and I was in a foot race at PS 134 in Queens, and I didn't expect to be a slowpoke, but everybody passed me. I thought I could do better than that, but not so. I saw everyone ahead of me, and I found myself the last person on the field, so I just stopped running. What I learned that day was not to enter any contest in which I couldn't at least place. I didn't have to win, but if I couldn't at least show some strength, I wasn't going into it. I didn't like losing. When I was in Georgia following my husband around during his officer training period, there was a time that I heard about John Wesley's work at Georgia. And I was at the Oglethorpe Hotel, and everybody was trying to tell me more about Wesley's work with the American Indians. And I said, so where are the Christian Indians? And they said, oh, it didn't work. He was a flop. And had a hard time trying to understand what went wrong. He was disappointed, but very willing to learn and prayed for help. Well, he got it in a very strange fashion. At that particular time, there was a group of Moravians, European first Christians, I would say. The Moravians were on shipboard with him, and this was a very bad, stormy crossing, so bad that it split the mainsail not once, but twice. It's probably should be said as a mainsail. Yeah. So the mainsail was split twice. The boat was named the Simons, and it was supposed to be one of the best, sturdiest ships at sea. But if it was any other ship, they probably would have sunk. But anyway, the Moravians still sang and prayed, and even though they suffered, Wesley repeatedly asked, why were they so secure and he was so scared? And they said, well, we have no fear of dying. We'll be with the Savior then. From that time on, he was more secure. For the last 8 weeks of the voyage, he found ways to feel, as the Moravians did, safe, though at any moment they could have all drowned. I learned a little bit more about defeat when my husband washed out of officers' training. And I had never seen him. It was worse than being disappointed, you know. I mean, he was being very hard on himself. And after I said, it's not your fault, he said, well, you know, they had an awful lot of men who were all looking for the same position. And I guess there just weren't enough openings for all of us. So he sort of, you know, got himself out of that terrible disappointment he was in. But I encouraged him to go for something else, and he was promoted to staff sergeant and started working with huge anti-aircraft guns and seemed to enjoy all that. Actually, it was that background and the math that he was learning that sent him into his profession all his life as a land surveyor. He learned that in those aircraft gun crews. He was disappointed until he found himself in the fight for the Philippines as a master gunner and crew chief. Well, it was a time when we were going to be separated, and I was pregnant, and I would be having our first child without its father around to see it, you know, and a lot of women had to get used to that. But my mother was a nurse, and I guess she made up for Daddy not being there, you know, taking care of me and wanting to know how the baby was doing. Anyway, at one point while I was reading from Kalas, he brought up Joshua's life from the Bible and the fact that as a young man he was Moses' assistant, which of course honored his parents too. And he later on in the town they were in, Joshua and Caleb and 10 other men were sent into a neighboring area to see if it was an area that could be won. And they came back with a vote 10-2. Only Caleb and Joshua said they could win. Everybody else was against it, so nothing was done. Not until 40 years later. Their convictions were put to the test. They won their first battle at Jericho, but only that one battle. And they took all the other defeats very, very hard, blaming God for not being with them. The story goes that God sent Joshua to find out more about the first defeat. And Joshua was in shock to find his men, instead of fighting the enemy, had been stealing gold and ceremonial garments from the temple instead of fighting. That city was burned to the ground. It was a terrible story. But that's why Joshua was considered, by the younger generation anyway, someone who was honest, could bring people together, and then if something did go wrong, find out why. A big, big thing for all of us to learn. When something's wrong, find out why. Well, at Boston University School of Theology, that happened to me. I had to find out why. The last 2 months were the worst in my young life. Why? Well, for those of you who know me, the next part of the story is pretty usual. Why we were picketing the Catholic bishop's residence to protest his attitude refusing to ordain women when we had 3 Catholic women in our class. No future for them at all. Well, we were very, very insistent in picketing. However, I received a call from the Methodist bishop's office where I was unceremoniously told if I wanted to be a BU graduate and be appointed to a church following that graduation, I was to immediately stop picketing Boston's Catholic bishop. So I stopped. My classmates, however, had elected me to be the reader at our graduation exercises of Dr. Martin Luther King's words. Why? Because according to them, I was the student who set the best example of King's stand on equality. Thankfully, with that help, we all graduated. So the first threat was behind me. I graduated. However, several months after graduation, I not only did not have a call to a church to the Southern New England Conference, I believe I was the only one in my class who did not. And I prayed. And my husband kept encouraging me as I had encouraged him when he was disappointed. Talk about defeat. I couldn't believe what was happening to me. I kept remembering, leave it to God, leave it to God. And I wondered, not knowing so much about God as I should have, why wasn't it easier and faster if he was helping me? What was taking him so long? Well, one day, completely out of the blue, I had another telephone call. It was from the Central Pennsylvania Conference, where my former pastor was now serving. Without even greeting me, he just said, Emmalou, my bishop's looking for someone to fill a 3-point charge with a radio ministry over WTTC Dewanda. If you're available, could you come down here Friday and meet the congregations? You're the only one with a qualification of a graduate of a good school and somebody who understands broadcasting? I had a one-word answer, certainly, certainly. And I immediately called Otto, who started to laugh. He was really roaring when he replied, "You couldn't get one church in New England, and now you have 3 in Pennsylvania, plus you wanted more than anything else, the radio ministry. God really wants you, woman. Stop fussing." Well, I remembered the words from an anthem in your church, and I think it really is important to why I chose to read this story today. It began, "I'm open and I am willing. To be hopeless would seem so strange." And I asked Lorraine if she'd read the first words, chapters to you. Where is it?
Where do you want me to start?
No. Here.
I am open and I am willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. So lift me up to the light of change. There's hurting in my family. There is sorrow in my town. There is panic in the nation. There's wailing in the whole world round. May the children see more clearly. May the elders be more wise. May the winds of change caress us, even though it burns our eyes. Give me a mighty oak to hold my confusion. Give me a desert to hold my fears. Give me a sunset to hold my wonder. Give me an ocean to hold my tears. For I am open and I am willing. So lift me up to the light of change.
Thank you. Well, when that came in the mail from Sally last month, I thought, that fits in with what I'm trying to say. When you're used to receiving or doing things and having it work, when you really fail at something, and you know it's defeat, you know that there's something else going on, it's very hard to overcome it. And so I thought, there had to be somebody else who suffered this most, the hard way. And I went back to Abraham Lincoln. From early life, he lost in love, and then he went through an almost unremitting list of defeats before being elected president. Yes, he was president, but oh, the critics that taunted him. He actually wrote a letter to a friend that began, "I am now the most miserable man living." Yet, he learned from those defeats. At his greatest victory, he said his most well-known words of healing, "With malice toward none and charity toward all." He's more remembered for those words than anything else he spoke. I remember when I finally realized preaching was suddenly not enough. I had served 8 churches, but there was something missing. I didn't know for sure until I was in a hospital one day, and I thought, that's what I should be doing. I should be a chaplain, not just a minister. And so I told Otto I wanted to go back to school. And by then we had 7 kids, and he's saying, "Well, I guess that's possible, isn't it? Have we got enough money?" And I said, "Yeah, the money isn't the problem, it's..." And I didn't finish the sentence. He said, "If this is what God is calling you to do, there's no other explanation needed." And it was so different, praying with individuals every day for what they needed. I learned a lot, a great deal. And some of the things that I learned about were things that are very, very personal. And I had no idea then how much our personal life would affect our bodies. And many, many times when I got to the bottom of what was wrong with somebody, it was because they were going through some kind of defeat. And divorce was the biggest problem. And so I looked back at the time, you know, when you're in love and everything's wonderful and you think it's all going to stay that way and it doesn't, how that can hurt you, how your body will suffer along with your brain, because the brain and the body are really connected, and as a chaplain I learned all that. However, more people survive differently. You know, some are mad at the opposite sex forever. Others remarry immediately to prove that divorce had nothing to do with them, it was all his fault or her fault. But many examine their defeat and become much better human beings. They learned. And believe it or not, my sister's girls, you know, if my mother had lived to hear it all, she would have really had a hard time with it. But anyway, all 4 girls were divorced. The 2 that were divorced twice, in their 3rd marriages, had the greatest marriages in the family. They really, really had good men. And I learned so much. Well, whatever it is that hurts you, you have to give it to a higher being and learn from it. And I learned more from watching those 2 girls with their husbands taking care of other guys' kids and having their own and being these wonderful fathers and a great husband for my nieces. And I thought, we keep learning. We keep learning. But how much of it can be credited to us and how much to God? Well, it depends on who we are. It depends on who we are and who we give the credit to. In my particular case, I only have 1 child divorced, and it's been terrible. And I can say to everybody who's here, if you've had to go through it in your family too, then you need special help. Don't forget your prayers. And if you really need a counselor, spend the money for it, because it's the hardest thing to get over. Yes, we lose people in death, but that has a different way of healing. In divorce, it's like an individual war, us against them. Know it and get help. Thank you for allowing me to come today.